All right, next on the program is George Swain, who is the son of Joan Swain. You guys have the same last name, that's great. George, you want to come up, and I'll have Joan introduce you and tell us a little bit about you first.
It's a pleasure for me to introduce my son George to you. I'm not crying, I just got a frog in my throat. George is the head. George is the head of the middle school at Poughkeepsie Day School in Poughkeepsie, New York. He previously held that position at Brooklyn Friends School in New York City. A liberal arts graduate from Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, he earned a master's degree in history at the State University of New York in Binghamton and studied under a Klingenstein Fellowship at Columbia University. George is active in the New York Independent School Association and is currently directing an educator leadership program for the organization. He lives in West Park, New York, with his wife Jessie and their children Izzy and Eli. I now look forward to learning something of what George thought about growing up as a child of a polio parent.
Thank you. Now, that's the first time my mom has introduced me, and it's a very big honor for me to be here in such a wonderful group with such a wonderful focus on such a wonderful day. So thank you very much for asking me. You've taken some of the great specifics of what I do. You know, what I didn't realize until I heard Dr. Hirsch this morning, I'm also an orthopedist. And I'll tell you why. I straighten out children. So I'm going to add that to my resume. That's sort of what I do as a middle school principal. I straighten out children. Sometimes I straighten out adults, but that's sort of just added fun. So I live right across the river from the FDR home in Hyde Park, and I highly encourage you, if you have not been there, to go and take a look at his wheelchair, but to also look at the lovely place where he lived and made a life for himself. And while you're there, I really also encourage you to take a spin down the walkway across the Hudson. If you are not aware of that tremendous resource that we have in the Hudson Valley, just last year it opened up, and there have been, I think, 500,000 visitors so far. But it's completely wheelchair accessible, and it's a wonderful way. You're 230 feet above the Hudson River, and you have a beautiful, expansive view. It's a restored railroad bridge over the Hudson River. It's about an hour and a half. It's actually an hour and 42 minutes from this place you're sitting right now, so you can gauge that accordingly. So I think this conference is a wonderful idea. I think it's absolutely fabulous to involve families directly in the conversation about polio and the late effects of polio, because families have always been very intimately involved with the individual people who have suffered from polio and suffered from the late effects of polio. I have a guarantee to make to you. I have absolutely nothing medically, scientifically, or historically important to say to you. At all. So unlike Dr. Hirsch, I doubt you'll walk around knowing very much more about anything after hearing what I have to say. But I hope I can at least touch on some of the perhaps emotional or familial aspects of what it means to struggle with something that's a real obstacle and a set of challenges throughout your life. So I am also wanting but we'll do a little swap out here. Oop, there you go, Lee. So my wife, who was planning to come down with me to this event, and my son are not here. And the reason is she was running a fever for the past 4 days, which is uncommon. And so I brought her to the doctor yesterday, and the doctor did some tests, and it turns out that she's got pneumonia. Now that's a drag, right? But she's going to get better. She's on antibiotics, and she's going to get better really quickly. But as I was watching the slideshow this morning, I thought, wow, what if this was 1949? What if this was 1952? How worried would I have been as I was driving down that street yesterday to go to the doctor to get those tests done? But I know she didn't have polio. I knew that. It didn't even occur to me. But that, you know, how different the world is right now, at least this world that we live in, where polio is all but eradicated. There's certainly other parts of the world as we saw in Dr. Hirsch's presentation, that where people still do have that worry. So it's my hope that people in those parts of the world will not for very much longer have to worry about whether or not their loved ones have contracted polio through the good work of the Rotary International and other organizations. How many people here in the room have read the book by Philip Roth, Nemesis? Has anybody? A few of you have. I would highly recommend that you read Philip Roth's novel, Nemesis, which came out, I think, last year, because it tells the tale of somebody of polio. And in fact, the nemesis in the title is the disease polio. That is sort of figures as a character almost in the novel. And while I thought, I love Philip Roth, and I've read many of his other books, but it seemed to me, having actually not lived through that time, but having heard the stories of that time and the fear that spun through the New Jersey where this is set, but also throughout the world, I think it was probably quite realistic. And I think it's a very enjoyable book. The one thing I didn't think was realistic about the book is the way that, and I won't spoil it for you, but one of the characters who contracts polio, it charts his life after the disease, and the way he dealt with polio as a disease and also what it meant to live with post-polio symptoms and such did not correspond with any reality I've ever experienced. I'm sure there are people that did relate that way, but while my mother, who stands as an incredible model for me, has always stood up to whatever challenges she has in front of her. And I think it has probably made her a stronger person rather than a weaker person. So that was my one problem with that book, but I do highly recommend it. So I came down from New York State, as I mentioned today, to this conference, about an hour and 45 minutes away, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to meet up with my mom when I get here, and I got here about 10:30, and I came into this room, and I thought, it's going to be easy. She's going to be the one in the scooter. So I looked around, and it was like a Where's Waldo book, you know? It's like, everybody's got a scooter, you know? So I no longer have such an easy way to identify my mother, but I thought, well, that's great news, because that means I'm in a place that's really going to understand what polio and post-polio is all about. I also, my mom mentioned I do some work with the State Association of Independent Schools in New York, and so one of the things, I guess the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree in terms of organizational skills, or at least liking to boss people around and being involved in organizing conferences and stuff. But I organize a conference with a couple colleagues for principals throughout New York State who work in independent schools. And one of the things that is so fabulous about this conference that we hold once a year is that it's a time when all of these principals from different schools throughout New York State get together, and they all get it. They all understand what it's like to be a principal at an independent school. Because when I go into work every day, there aren't a whole lot of people I can talk to about how difficult my job might be, how I don't know the answers to problems, because the teachers are looking at me, and the kids are looking at me, and the parents are looking at me as if I've got all the answers. So I think that I just encourage you to look around your table, look around the room, look at the other people who get it, who understand what it's like, whose situation may be different than yours, but who really understand what your struggles might be like. And I hope you take an opportunity to continue to come back to conferences like this each year to see people that you may not see in between, but you recognize each time you come back. So my first memories as a child of polio are ones, it's hard to actually think back and try to imagine, how do I separate the person my mother was from the person my mother might have been if she hadn't had polio, because my mom and polio have always been very interconnected in my life. And as a child, I never really saw it as a disability. I never saw it as something that was particularly challenging to my mother. I don't think I had any idea in terms of how much strength she needed to compensate for things that were difficult for her. Like many of you, she contracted the disease in 1949, so around the same period of time probably that many of you contracted polio, and then spent time in a rehabilitation hospital, like many of you, or in a critical care facility first, but then in a rehabilitation hospital. And then she went home and lived at home with her parents, and then she went to community college, and then left home and left the area to go off to university. So she married and started a family. And I have a sister who is not with us today, but who lives in San Francisco. So my sister and I learned from a very early age that being a helper was a really important part of how a family works. You know, that we didn't often think of, well, of course we were kids, we thought of ourselves first, but then once we stopped thinking about ourselves, because my mother said something like, stop thinking about yourself first, and help me out getting these groceries in, we realized that we had some really important jobs in the house, you know, and those jobs included going grocery shopping, helping push the cart around the aisles, lifting heavy things, you know, moving stuff from place to place. But my early memories are of a very strong and determined person. You know, and my early memories also include somebody who was out gardening in the yard, somebody who was cooking dinners frequently, somebody who was preparing things, taking care of all the kinds of work that had to happen in the house, but also driving a car and taking me all the kinds of places I needed to go as a child, and shopping and getting in and out of pools and lakes and ponds. You know, things that, you know, it didn't occur to me how difficult it might be to get from that place into that car, but she would do it. It might have taken her a little bit longer, and maybe I had to stand around and hold some crutches or, you know, stabilize her a little bit, but she was really, really active and engaged and involved. She worked as a reporter in our town, writing a weekly column for the local newspaper. And she worked on the board of a local library and then began to work full-time. And so have built a career working full-time. And, you know, people have always remarked to me what an exceptional person your mother is. And I thought, well, yeah, sure, that's true, you know, but she's my mom, you know. But I think that is true, you know, that she is an exceptional person. And I think that what didn't strike me as a child was how truly exceptional people who have to overcome some of the great physical difficulties that she had to overcome and that many of you in this room have had to overcome really are exceptional. You know, that you have all the same challenges that all the rest of us have, and then a couple more. But that said, polio wasn't a huge part of my childhood. I mean, sure, we didn't go on skiing vacations, maybe like some of my friends did, or, you know, big, long bicycle treks as a family. But I never really at all felt like, you know, that I was deprived or, you know, missing out on anything important. And it's just what people do. You know, this is just what people do. They go about their lives. They go, and certain families have certain things they like to do. And that's sort of the way I saw it. You know, what happened, though, as polio, I think, made a transition into post-polio, was that I saw this person who had incredible strength and stamina and endurance and ability not have some of those any longer. You know, and so about the same time that I went off to college in the mid-'80s, or I guess it was the early '80s, I went off to college, and so I was moving out of the house sort of at the same time my mother was sort of changing in terms of the abilities she might have and the needs she might have, and I think the ability to sort of, I don't remember really talking very much about it. You know, I was pretty obsessed with myself at that point in my life, as all you know, people in college are. I probably never even asked, but I think that it was so unclear to her and to other people how to separate the differences between aging and post-polio. You know, it's just, well, I'm in my, you know, she was in her 50s or early 60s or whatever it might have been, and you know, this is just sort of what happens as you get older. But I think it was then became very clear that that this wasn't just the aging process. You know, that it was somehow different. It was partly that, but it was partly something else. I mean, how many people in the room remember a time when you went to the doctor to get something checked out, and the doctor said, "Oh, you're just getting older"? I mean, is that a common? Yeah, that's common, right? And so I think what Dr. Hirsch said earlier is, you know, so important that, you know, you often have been in a position to train your doctors to understand something that they don't really understand, and that's a sort of an awkward and unusual position to be in. You know, and how does it feel to have somebody who doesn't understand what's going on for you say, "Oh, I understand what's going on for you. It's just the aging part." It doesn't feel great. It's sort of like having that couple that doesn't have children, but they have a dog say, "I know just what it's like. I know just what having kids is like. I mean, I've got to take my dog out 3 times a day, and I can't take vacations anymore." And you look at him and you say, "Really?" No, having kids is a little bit more challenging than that, but it's a lot more fun, too. So one of the things I think is so fascinating to me as I was thinking about this, because polio, there was a recent epidemic, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, there was an epidemic of polio, and then quickly afterward there was a sort of a vaccine and a solution to polio, which all but eradicated polio in this country. you're not only a generation that's figuring out what post-polio is all about, really for the first time with your doctors, you're also a generation that's sort of paving your own way, but there's not a whole lot of people coming behind you either that are going to be, you're paving the way for yourselves. And I think that can be a very isolating and lonely thing too. As Dr. Hirsch pointed out, there's not a whole lot of funding coming through the pipeline because it isn't a big boom. It's not like diabetes or trying to get heavy people to be thinner. I mean, there are a lot of growth industries in this country, and post-polio syndrome is not one of them. So I do hope that you will continue to be as perseverant and to be as strong and strong advocates for yourselves as I'm sure you have been. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself because it relates in some ways to something that happened to me this year, which brought me very close in a personal way to what rehabilitation is like. Because I'd never really been in a situation to have to be rehabilitated. Well, my wife would tell you there were plenty of situations I should have been rehabilitated for, but I never admitted to any of them. So I am an endurance bicycle racer. In addition to being a principal and working in schools, I race my bicycle very, very long distances. And it was sort of my personal midlife crisis. I said, I'm going to not get a fast red car. I'm going to get on my bike and see how far I can go and how fast I can get there. So I go out on races of 100 miles, 200 miles, 300 miles, 400 miles. In 2009, I completed a race from London to Edinburgh, Scotland, and back, which is 875 miles, and I did that in 100 hours. So I did very little, if you do the math, I did very little sleeping in that period of time. So that's just a little background. On August 26th of this past year, I was on a bicycle event. It was a 3-day, 1,000-kilometer bicycle event, and within the first 2 hours, just before dawn, I was hit by a car. So I was hit by a car, and I don't have any memory, thankfully, of this happening, but I was hit by a car, and so the next thing I knew, I was lying in a hospital bed, and I'd broken 25 bones. Now, that's 12% of the bones in my whole body, and most of those are in your ear. So, I was hit by a distracted driver, and I had broken 25 bones. So I broke my femur, broke my right femur, broke my left hip. I broke about 12 different ribs. I broke my scapula, my clavicle, my scapula. I broke all kinds of things. Luckily, I didn't break the most important bone, which is my head. But I broke bones I can't even pronounce. And very soon after this had happened, my mother showed up at my bedside, and she didn't live too far away, but within a short period of time, came by and was right there with me, And so the tables were turned. I could barely move. I was lying in my bed and I could barely move. And here was this highly mobile person scooting around, sort of pouring salt in my wounds. No, just kidding. It was very nice to see you. But as I became more mobile, I was still unable to move 3 out of my 4 limbs. So I had broken, it was ironic. The one limb I could actually put weight on was the femur that had broken, but they put a titanium rod in there so I could quickly stand on it. But the other 3 limbs, for 6 weeks, I wasn't able to bear weight on. So I went from a critical care hospital to a rehabilitation hospital. And so I went to the Helen Hayes Hospital, which is up in the Hudson Valley, not far from West Point. It's a wonderful place. If you ever have need to go to a rehabilitation hospital or recommend one, I'd highly recommend Helen Hayes. It's a wonderful place with a wonderful staff of physicians and also therapists and occupational and physical therapists. And my mom came to visit me all the time. She was always up there, every other day or every few days she'd be up to visit with me. So I had to get transferred up to this hospital via ambulance, about 200 miles away, because it was in Pennsylvania where I had the accident, and then about 200 miles by ambulance to the hospital. And I get there, and I'm put in the spinal floor, because they don't really know where to put a guy like me. So they figure, because I didn't have any spinal damage, I broke some spinal bones, but I didn't damage my spinal cord. But they put me in the spinal floor. Now, if you've never been to the spinal floor of a rehabilitation hospital, let me paint a little picture for you. The place is filled with guys. You know why the place is filled with guys? Guys aren't too bright. guys fall out of trees when they're trying to trim that tree that's just a limb that's a little too far off. They're the people that fall off the roof when they're cleaning the gutters. They're the people that get a little too drunk at the party and dive into the swimming pool. So I was almost really 90% of the people on the spinal floor at the hospital at that time were men, and some of them I think really, and they crashed their motorcycles. And in fact, I think the women that were there were actually there because of men, like that had hit them in a car and stuff. But I loved these guys, and I came to really appreciate what the struggles were that these guys were involved with. So nobody there was suffering from polio, obviously. This is 2010, that wouldn't be an issue. But these were all people, some of whom were never going to be able to walk again, some of whom were going to be able to, weren't sure what kind of rehabilitation they had. And so it put me, I almost felt like I was sort of cheating, or I was on vacation or something, because I knew that I was going to come back to pretty full strength. I had just broken bones. And breaking bones, broken bones fix themselves. The body's pretty amazing that way. So while I was sort of like a basket case at first, I knew that 6 to 8, 10, 12 weeks later, I was going to be fine. But it put me into a frame of mind of what it would be like to have no idea how fine you're going to be. To not have any idea whether you're going to be able to move a limb again, whether you're going to be able to walk again, whether you're going to be able to hold your child and pass him around again. All these things that these people I was living with and became very, very close friends with were struggling with. So it really put me in a place that I had never been before, and it made me understand a little bit what it might have been like in 1949, 1950, 1952 to contract polio and to not know. Am I going to be in this iron lung forever? Am I going to be in this iron lung for a short period of time? And so what I was thinking about when Dr. Hirsch was speaking is I think there were sort of two schools that the therapists came from that I worked with. There were the people from the Sister Kenny School, and there were the people from the Rush School. And it was sort of a combination, and they each had their own strengths. And I used to dread it when people from the Kenny School came by, because I knew it was going to hurt. But I figured it was probably also really good for me. So after 6 weeks, I left the hospital, and I have continued to be in physical therapy. I had 3 surgeries, one of which was actually after I left, and so I'm still in rehabilitation, I can't lift my arm higher than that, but I'm optimistic it might go a little bit higher as I get more physical therapy. But again, I have no idea. Am I ever going to be able to raise that arm? Now that's a pretty minor issue, frankly, who cares if they can raise their left arm? I can raise this one. So I will be counted. But it makes me just think about, what is it like to not know? What is it like to not know? And how do you have to rethink the things that you thought you might do in your life as a result? Once I got to handlebar height, I told the surgeon, that's okay. I just have to be able to reach the handlebars. But some of the insights I had in this experience was, the world looks different from a chair than it does when you're standing up. It really does. The world is not built for chairs. The world is built for chairs around tables, but the world's not built for chairs to move around. And it's very, very difficult to get things sometimes because you're in a world that's not designed to meet the vantage point that you take it from. I was amazed by how little is set up, even in this day and age, with people who have mobility challenges in mind. I'll tell you a brief little example of that. My mom would come up and we'd have lunch, not in, they'd serve me lunch in the hospital room generally, but when you'd have a visitor come up, you'd go down to the place for staff and visitors to eat. And so we would go down to the nice little cafe and eat some food. The door going out and coming in to the patio from the place where, at the Helen Hayes Hospital, they're serving people food, is not a handicapped door. It's not a door that automatically opens and closes. So the two of us are sitting there holding trays in our wheelchairs thinking, I hope somebody comes by, opens this door for us. I mean, what if 2 people who are actually visiting somebody in the hospital need to get in and out? They just assume, okay, we know how to treat the people that are in the hospital for, rehabilitation, but God forbid anybody who's actually challenged getting around or maybe is in a wheelchair is coming to visit, And so that was something that was really eye-opening to me. I learned that it's very frustrating to be dependent upon other people for everything. I mean, it's okay to be a little dependent on other people, but to have to know that I can't get out of this bed until somebody answers that bell. I don't have the physical strength to get into that wheelchair on the other side of the room. I need somebody else. First I needed 2 somebody else's, then I just got down to needing 1 somebody else to get me from the bed into that chair. I liked them, they were lovely, but they had other things to do. So you ring the bell, you keep ringing the bell, and nobody shows up, and you get a little grumpy, you know? And, you know, so it's very difficult to be dependent on other people, and it's very frustrating, even if you love them. And the other thing I learned is that through hard work, it's possible to make incredible progress. You know, so I think that, you know, I saw differences in the way people, the speed with which people got better. And I think people that were able to summon some type of deep inner reserve to be able to power through those difficult times and to not say, you know what, this really is so awful that I'm here, and just sort of turn inward, but to say, you know what, I'm just going to see how much I can do. And that's what the issue is I had with the character in Nemesis, is that isn't the approach that that character took, but it is the approach that most people I know who've had polio have taken. So how are we doing on time? Okay, because I wanted to actually take an opportunity to get you guys to talk a little bit about this with one another. This is what we in the business called a think, pair, share. And a think, pair, share is I'm going to ask you a question that I'd like you to think about. Then I'm going to ask you to pair, or it could be triples. It could be, I'd like to ask you to look around the table and find somebody else to chat with your thought about these questions and share those with each other. So if you're here with somebody in your family, that might be the most ideal person to talk to. But you might not be here with somebody in your family, and you could talk to anybody about these questions. And you may want to also think about, okay, if my family member was here, how would I think about this question? So they're very simple questions. You can't fail this test, I promise. So the first question is, what is your first memory of polio? Right? So if you are somebody who had polio, that would be a certain memory. If you were somebody who didn't have polio, you also have a first memory of polio. So I'd like you to think about that for yourself. What was your first memory? And I'd like you to think about the second question is, what was your first memory of post-polio or late effect polio? Or the other thing, what's the other euphemism? I forget what that was that Dr. Hirsch mentioned. But the post-polio syndrome, what is your first memory of that? So those are the two questions. And then there's a third question. Depending on which category you fall into, you're going to have a different third question. So everybody's got the first two questions are the same. But the third question is, what is something that you want everybody to know about post-polio syndrome? That would be for the people who actually have post-polio syndrome or are affected by that. What's one thing you would like your family members, the people that you go to the doctor's office and talk to, what's one thing that you think maybe they don't know that you'd really like them to know? About your experience, about what it feels like, about anything. And then the other question, this would be for the people that did not have polio, would be, what's one thing you'd like to know about post-polio syndrome that you were afraid to ask or just never thought to ask? So is that clear? I don't have a PowerPoint, I don't have any. So what's your first memory of polio, your first memory of post-polio, and what do you want to know or what do you want somebody else to know about post-polio? And so we'll just take a few minutes to do this. If you could think about that. Find somebody at the table, each just take turns sharing your thoughts, and then we'll come back together again. Sound good? Okay. Okay, I hate to cut this conversation short, but I know it's the end of the program, and some of you are going to need to sort of get in your cars and go. But what I'll encourage you to do is to continue this conversation. If you haven't had this conversation with the people that you came with, I would encourage you to do that, because it's amazing how even growing up in a home with a mom who had polio before I was born, and to watching the way that she has gone about her life, and knowing that she's very involved in even the post-polio support movement through this organization, I still don't talk to my mom very often about these questions. And I think that it's important for us, that part of that family support has to do with having these kinds of conversations about what's difficult, what help you might need, and what it's like to be somebody who doesn't know how to help and doesn't know when to ask if you need help. Because if you spent your whole life with a type A personality who seems to solve her own problems, you don't really develop the habit of asking if she needs help. And, so I think that's something to think about. So how many people in the room have seen the film 127 Hours with James Franco? Did anybody see that movie? You didn't see that movie. Well, that's actually okay. It's not the best movie. It's a pretty good movie. Has anybody read the book Between a Rock and a Hard Place? Okay, that's actually better. You should probably read that. That's a book written by this guy named Aaron Ralston. So Aaron Ralston was this sort of wisecracking, well, not really. He's portrayed that way in the film, which is what I didn't like about it. But he is a young 20-something guy, early 30s guy, who goes off on a trip as a mountain climber, doesn't tell anybody where he's going, and he has an accident. And he has an accident, and this giant boulder lands on his arm. And it pins him down, and he's unable to move his arm. So over the course of 127 hours, he winds up chopping his own arm off. It's pretty grim and grisly, but he's alive. And if he hadn't done that, he wouldn't be alive right now. So he's alive today, and he's gone through rehabilitation and therapy, and he is walking around the world with half an arm. And one of the things he includes in his book is that if I had it to do over again, knowing everything I know about myself now, I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't have my arm back if it meant that I wouldn't know all those things I know about myself now that I learned as a result of not having an arm. So that was really challenging to me to read. I thought, is that really true? But then I thought about it, and I thought, you know, if I could turn back the clock to before I had my bike accident, before I broke all those bones and had to have all that metal put in my body and maybe not to be able to use my arm again, would I do it? And the answer is no, I wouldn't turn back the clock because I've learned things about myself. I feel like I'm a better person now than I was before that happened. And I don't know how you would answer that question, having had to live a life in the shadow of polio yourselves. Would you turn back the clock? Your answer might be yes, I would. It's really been awful to have to live with polio, and I wish I could undo that. But if you don't say yes to that question, it might be interesting to think about, you know, how polio has helped make you the person you are today. What would you have been like if you never had polio? That's an interesting question. So I just thought that was interesting to think about. One of the direct results of polio in my life, because I didn't suffer from it, one of the direct results of that disease was it has made me a more empathetic person. My wife often asks me, well, you know, why are you so, how can you sort of understand the underdog's point of view? Why is it that you so easily seem to understand how difficult somebody else might be having it? And I think that if I trace it back, that probably has a lot to do with the fact that I understood the world from a different point of view through my mother's eyes all the way from childhood. So I think even sometimes things that have made us stronger people, you know, are not aware to us. We're not aware of unless we really look back at it. So, you know, there's no going backward, and I hope you guys have begun a conversation that you can continue. It's been an honor to be here. I want to thank you very, very much for inviting me to be a part of this special event. And, you know, I think, you know, as we say in my school, a lot of learning happens when you reflect on something and when you discuss something. So I think it's important for us all to continue to learn and learn from one another. So I thank you for your time today, and thanks for asking me to be here.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much. George, I actually want to thank you, George, because you just gave me an opportunity to tell my daughter's story, which nobody in my family knows. So that was very nice. She was laughing. First time she heard that. I'd like to thank, I think we're going to wrap things up now. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I hope that everyone leaves with a little more knowledge than what they came with, and even more importantly, that they made at least one new friend before they leave. I'm going to leave the mic here. This could be open mic. If anyone wants to say anything about anybody, more than welcome. Just come on up and, you know, just don't talk too long, though. It's getting late. But open mic, if you want to sing, hey, that's great too. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you all enjoyed the conference. Thank you.